1948, a year that changed South Africa forever. On the surface, it was just another election, but in reality, it marked the beginning of one of the darkest social engineering experiments in modern history. A system that legally divided people by race, dictated where they could live, who they could marry, and even which jobs they could hold. A system the world would later come to know as apartheid. But here is the thing most people don't realize. Apartheid didn't just appear out of nowhere in 1948. It was the product of centuries of conquest, colonization, and racial hierarchy, carefully built brick by brick until it was cemented into law. In today's documentary, we'll trace the dark origins of apartheid from the first Dutch settlers who arrived in 1652 to the British who expanded the empire, to the rise of Afrikaner's nationalism and the National Party victory that made apartheid official. By the end of this video, you understand not just how apartheid began, but why it was able to survive for nearly half a century. So stick with me, because this story reveals how history, power, and prejudice collided to create one of Africa's darkest chapters. The story of apartheid begins long before the word itself was ever coined. In 1652, Dutch settlers under the Dutch East India Company landed at the Cape of Good Hope, establishing a supply station for ships traveling to Asia. These settlers, later known as the Boers of Afrikaners, gradually expanded inland, taking land from the indigenous Khoisan and San peoples. By the late 1600s, slavery was introduced and racial hierarchies began to harden. When the British took control of the Cape in 1806, they abolished slavery by 1834, but rather than creating equality, this fueled resentment among Afrikaners who still clung to the idea of white superiority. The Great Trek of the 1830s and 1840s, where Boers moved north to form their own republics, laid the groundwork for future racial segregation. Fast forward to the late 19th century, when diamonds were discovered in Kimberley in 1867 and gold in the Witwatersrand in 1886. Suddenly, South Africa became an economic powerhouse, but this wealth relied on the cheap labor of black South Africans who were systematically pushed into inferior positions. The Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, between the British and the Boers further complicated matters. When the British won, they established the Union of South Africa in 1910, uniting 4 provinces under white rule. This new union made one thing clear: power would remain in the hands of whites, while black South Africans were denied the vote, denied land, and denied opportunity. Even before apartheid was official, segregation was already entrenched in law. In 1913, the South African government passed the Native Land Act, which reserved about 87% of the land for white ownership, leaving black South Africans with just a fraction of the land, often barren and overcrowded. Families were uprooted, and generations were condemned to poverty. The 1927 Native Administration Act gave the government sweeping power to control African communities. Meanwhile, laws restricted interracial marriage, political participation, and even movements between provinces. By the 1930s and 1940s, South Africa was a country already divided along racial lines. But it was the rise of Afrikaner nationalism that would take these divisions to a whole new level. By the 1940s, South Africa was a deeply divided country. White South Africans made up only about 20% of the population, but they held nearly all the political and economic power. And even among whites, there were divisions. The English-speaking elites descended from the British, and the Afrikaners descended from Dutch settlers. The Afrikaners had a long memory. They remembered losing the Anglo-Boer War at the hands of the British in 1902. They remembered the scorched earth policies and the concentration camps where thousands of Afrikaner women and children died. This pain, combined with a sense of cultural pride, fueled a new political movement, Afrikaner nationalism. One of the most influential groups in this movement was Broederbond, a secretive society of Afrikaner men. Founded in 1918, the Broederbond's mission was to unite Afrikaners, promote their language, and ensure Afrikaner dominance in South Africa. They infiltrated politics, education, the church, and even business. Their influence was immense. By the time World War II ended in 1945, Afrikaner nationalists felt sidelined by the British-descended elite who controlled mining and finance. The Afrikaners, many of them poor farmers, wanted to protect their identity, and they saw racial segregation as the way to do it. This ideology found its political voice in the National Party, led by Dr. Daniel Francois Malon. Malon promised to formalize and strengthen racial separation into a complete system. He called it Apartheid, an Afrikaans word meaning apartness. The general election of May 26, 1948 would become one of the most pivotal moments in South African history. The ruling United Party, led by John Smuts, campaigned on moderate racial policies. Smuts had been a respected figure internationally, even working on the creation of the United Nations. But at home, many whites, especially Afrikaners, saw him as too liberal, too willing to allow limited rights for Black South Africans. The National Party, on the other hand, offered something different. Their manifesto promised stricter racial separation, better jobs for whites, and laws to prevent racial mixing. They used fear to rally their base, painting images of a swamped white minority if Black South Africans were given equal rights. To the shock of many, the National Party won. They didn't get the majority of votes. In fact, they secured only about 38% of the national votes. But due to the way parliamentary seats were distributed, they ended up with a majority in parliament. When D.F. Malone was sworn in as Prime Minister on June 4, 1948, apartheid was no longer just an idea, it was a government policy. Immediately after taking power, the National Party began passing laws that codified apartheid into the very fabric of society. The prohibition of mixed marriages, the Immorality Amendment Act, the Population Registration Act, the Groups Area Act, and the Pass Laws Act. These laws were just the beginning. Over the next decades, apartheid expanded into every corner of life: education, healthcare, public facilities, and even beaches. Of course, these measures did not go unchallenged. In 1912, decades later, African leaders had already formed the South African Native National Congress, later renamed the African National Congress, ANC. By the 1950s, the ANC began organizing protests, strikes, and acts of civil disobedience. In 1952, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, encouraging Black South Africans to deliberately break apartheid laws by entering whites-only areas without passes. Tens of thousands participated, but the government's response was brutal. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo were arrested. Laws were tightened even further, and in 1953, the apartheid state introduced the Bantu Education Act, which deliberately gave black children an inferior education designed only to prepare them for low-paying jobs. By the mid-1950s, apartheid was no longer just a policy, it was a complete system, a machine of racial oppression designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. By the late 1950s, apartheid had already created a suffocating system of racial oppression. The pass laws were among the most hated of all apartheid policies. Black South Africans had to carry passbooks everywhere they went, and police regularly harassed and arrested those who failed to produce them. On March 21, 1960, in the township of Sharpeville near Johannesburg, thousands of protesters gathered outside the police station. The demonstration was organized by the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, a breakaway from the ANC, under the leadership of Robert Sobukwe. Their strategy was simple but powerful. People would present themselves at police stations without their passes, demanding arrest. The idea was to overwhelm the system, but the response was catastrophic. Police opened fire on the unarmed crowd. In a matter of minutes, 69 people lay dead and over 180 were wounded. Most were shot in the back as they tried to flee. The massacre shocked the world. The government declared a state of emergency, banned the ANC and PAC, and arrested thousands of activists. Peaceful protests now seemed impossible. Among the deeply affected by Sharpeville was Nelson Mandela, a young lawyer and activist with the ANC. Until then, Mandela and the ANC had championed non-violent resistance. But after Sharpeville, many leaders felt they had no choice but to fight fire with fire. In 1961, Mandela and others founded Umkhonto weZizwe, Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC. Their mission was to sabotage, targeting government buildings, power stations, and infrastructure without killing civilians. Mandela traveled across Africa to seek support and military training. But by 1962, he was arrested and sentenced to 5 years for incitement and leaving the country illegally. 2 years later, in 1964, he and other ANC leaders were put on trial in what would become known as the Rivonia trial. Facing the death penalty, Mandela delivered his now famous speech, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Instead of execution, Mandela and his comrades were sentenced to life imprisonment. He would spend the next 27 years behind bars, mostly on Robben Island, becoming the face of resistance. By the 1960s, apartheid was no longer just a South African issue, it was a global scandal. The United Nations condemned apartheid, calling it a crime against humanity. African nations newly independent from colonial rule pushed for international sanctions. In 1962, the UN passed a resolution calling on the countries to cut off trade and arms sales to South Africa. However, many Western powers, including the United States and Britain, were reluctant. The Cold War loomed large, and South Africa was seen as a key ally against communism. Still, international opposition grew. By the late 1960s, artists, students, and activists around the world launched boycotts, refusing to play in South Africa, refusing to buy South African goods and demanding corporations divest. One of the most symbolic protests was in the world of sports. In 1964, South Africa was banned from the Olympic Games. By the 1970s, international cricket and rugby teams refused to play them. Sports, once a source of pride for the apartheid state, became a global embarrassment. Despite the international pressure, apartheid only grew harsher inside South Africa. In 1976, the government introduced a new law requiring that schools for Black South Africans teach certain subjects in Afrikaans rather than English. For many students, Afrikaans was seen as the language of oppression, the tongue of the apartheid state. On June 16, 1976, thousands of students in Soweto, a township outside Johannesburg, marched in protest. They carried placards reading, "Down with Afrikaans" and "We want equal education." What began as a peaceful demonstration turned into a massacre. Police fired live ammunition into the crowds. By the end of that day, at least 176 students were killed. Some estimates put the number much higher. One photograph in particular shocked the world. A dying 13-year-old boy named Hector Peterson being carried by another student and his sister running beside them in tears. This image became an icon of apartheid's cruelty. The Soweto uprising sparked months of nationwide unrest. Hundreds more were killed in clashes, but it also reignited the struggle, inspiring a new generation of young activists to join the fight. Amid the waves of resistance rose a powerful new voice, Steve Biko. In the early 1970s, Biko founded the Black Consciousness Movement, which encouraged Black South Africans to embrace their identity, reject feelings of inferiority, and fight psychological oppression. He believed true liberation required not just political freedom, but also mental emancipation. Biko's words inspired thousands of students and activists, but the government saw him as a threat. In 1977, he was arrested, brutally beaten in police custody, and died at the age of 30. His death, like Sharpeville and Soweto, became another rallying cry for resistance. International outreach grew louder, and the world could no longer look away. By the late 1970s, apartheid was still in full force, but the cracks were beginning to show. Resistance inside South Africa was stronger than ever. Outside, international condemnation and sanctions continued to mount. Yet, the apartheid state dug in its heels, determined to preserve white minority rule at any cost. The next decade, the 1980s, would bring even more unrest, brutal repression, and finally, the beginning of apartheid's collapse. By the 1980s, apartheid had been in a place for more than 3 decades. Entire generations of Black South Africans had grown up under racial segregation, forced removals, and systematic humiliation. But resistance was stronger than ever, and the apartheid regime was beginning to lose control. Inside the country, uprisings and strikes spread like wildfire. The Soweto protests of 1976 had ignited a new spirit of defiance. By the early 1980s, trade unions and student organizations were at the forefront of the struggle. In 1983, a broad coalition known as the United Democratic Front (UDF) was formed, uniting over 400 groups against apartheid. The government responded with brutal force. In 1985, President P.W. Botha declared a state of emergency, granting the police and military sweeping powers. Thousands were detained without trial. Torture disappearances became commonplace, but instead of crushing resistance, this only fueled anger. Outside South Africa, the world's patience had run out. Throughout the 1980s, international sanctions tightened. Western companies pulled out of South Africa and many nations banned trade, oil exports, and financial investments. The global Free Mandela campaign spread across campuses and cities, turning Nelson Mandela, still imprisoned on Robben Island, into a symbol of the global fight for justice. In 1986, the United States passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, overriding a veto by President Ronald Reagan. Britain under Margaret Thatcher resisted sweeping sanctions, but even she faced immense pressure from activists and the Commonwealth. By the late 1980s, South Africa was in crisis. The economy was collapsing under sanctions. Townships were erupting in rebellion. The military was overstretched, fighting not only protesters at home, but also wars in neighboring Angola and Namibia. In 1989, Botha suffered a stroke and was forced to resign. His successor, F.W. de Klerk, recognized what Botha could not. Apartheid was unsustainable. On February 2, 1990, de Klerk made a historic announcement before the parliament. The ANC and the other banned political groups would be legalized. Political prisoners would be released, and South Africa would begin negotiations for a new political order. 9 days later, on February 11, 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela walked free. The world watched in awe as the tall, grey-haired figure raised his fist in triumph, walking hand in hand with his wife, Winnie Mandela. It was a moment that symbolized hope after decades of darkness. Mandela's release did not mean the struggle was over. The early 1990s were some of the most violent years in South Africa's history. As negotiations for a democratic South Africa began, violence erupted between rival groups. The apartheid government secretly armed factions to create instability, hoping to weaken the ANC. Townships burned and thousands were killed in political clashes, but Mandela remained steady alongside de Klerk. He worked to steer the country towards democracy. In 1993, both men were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. Finally, in April 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. For the first time, Black South Africans could vote. Long lines stretched outside polling stations as millions cast ballots. When the results came in, the ANC had won by a landslide. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was sworn in as South Africa's first Black president. His inauguration at the Union Buildings in Pretoria was attended by leaders from around the world. The nightmare of apartheid had ended. The story of how apartheid began and how it ended is a reminder of both the darkness of human prejudice and the resilience of those who resist it. From the first settlers in 1652 to the election of 1948 to Mandela's release in 1990, this history reveals how laws can divide people, but also how people can rise to break them. If you stayed with me through this journey, you now know the roots of apartheid, how it became law, and how it finally fell. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to explore more hidden truths of African history, culture, and people. Until next time, remember, history isn't just the past, it's the foundation of the present.